Right now, Lionel and I have the honor of announcing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 2026. Wow. Sade!
She never needed to chase fame to become a legend. With her soft, unforgettable voice and timeless songs like Smooth Operator and No Ordinary Love, Sade Adu became one of the most admired artists in music history. But behind the elegance and success was a life filled with heartbreak, a painful divorce, legal trouble, and a growing desire to escape the spotlight. So why did one of the world's biggest stars suddenly disappear from public life? And what has Sade been doing all these years? Today, we're uncovering the story of what really happened to Sade. From fashion designer to global star, Sade Adu was born Helen Sade Adu on January 16, 1959, in Ibadan, Nigeria. Her father was Nigerian, while her mother was English, and when Sade was still very young, her parents separated. She eventually moved to England with her mother and brother, growing up in Essex. As a teenager, Sade developed a deep love for American soul and R&B. She was drawn to singers like Curtis Mayfield, Donny Hathaway, and Bill Withers, artists who could create emotion without relying on huge vocals or flashy performances. That understated approach would eventually become one of Sade's greatest strengths. Interestingly, music wasn't originally supposed to be her career. Sade studied fashion design in London and dreamed of becoming a designer. She even opened a small boutique and modeled some of her own creations. At the time, she seemed far more likely to build a career in fashion than become an international recording artist. But everything changed when a friend asked her to perform backing vocals with a band called Pride. Sade agreed, even though she had little formal singing experience. At first, she was simply helping out, but audiences quickly noticed something different about her. Her calm delivery and distinctive voice gave the band a completely different atmosphere. Soon, Sade began performing with 3 musicians who would become central to her career: Stuart Matthewman, Andrew Hale, and Paul Denman. Together, they developed a sound that mixed soul, jazz, pop, and smooth rhythms. Instead of trying to compete with the powerful vocalists dominating the charts, Sade went in the opposite direction. She became quieter, more controlled, more intimate, and somehow that made people listen even more closely. One of the songs that helped attract attention was Smooth Operator. Its sophisticated story of a charming but dangerous man perfectly matched the mysterious atmosphere Sade and the musicians were creating. Record companies soon became interested. But there was a problem. The labels wanted Sade as a solo artist. Sade didn't want to abandon the musicians who had helped create her sound. For roughly a year and a half, she reportedly turned down offers because she wanted the group to remain together. Eventually, she signed with Epic Records in 1983, but she made sure several of her longtime collaborators came with her. That decision would prove incredibly important. In 1984, the group released their debut album, Diamond Life. Almost immediately, something extraordinary happened. The woman who had once been more comfortable behind the scenes was suddenly everywhere. Your Love is King became a major hit in Britain, while Smooth Operator introduced Sade to audiences around the world. Her music sounded sophisticated without being complicated. Her appearance was equally distinctive. The slicked-back hair, large earrings, simple clothes, and calm expression became part of an instantly recognizable identity. But Sade wasn't trying to manufacture a celebrity image. This was simply how she dressed and carried herself. The success of Diamond Life transformed Sade from a relatively unknown singer into an international star. The group toured extensively, and Sade discovered that performing live gave her something recordings couldn't: a direct connection with the audience. Then came the next major test. Could she follow one successful album with another? In 1985, the answer became clear. The band released Promise, an album that expanded the sound they had created on their debut. It included songs such as The Sweetest Taboo, Is It a Crime, and Never as Good as the First Time. The album became a massive success, reaching #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States. Within only a few years, Sade had gone from studying fashion and performing in small venues to becoming one of the most recognizable voices in music. And in 1986, she received one of the biggest honors an artist could hope for. Sade won the Grammy Award for Best New Artist, but while her career was reaching new heights, something else was beginning to happen. The more famous Sade became, the more uncomfortable she felt with fame itself, and that would eventually change the direction of her entire life. When fame came at a price, winning a Grammy in 1986 should have been the beginning of an even bigger chapter for Sade. And in many ways, it was. But success came with a side of fame that Sade never really wanted. She had already performed at Live Aid in 1985, standing on the stage at Wembley Stadium in front of an enormous global audience. For millions of people, it was a dream moment. For Sade, however, the attention that came with becoming a superstar was becoming increasingly difficult to handle. She wasn't interested in celebrity parties or constantly being photographed. She disliked journalists digging into her private life, especially when she felt that some stories being published about her weren't true. So she began protecting herself. She gave fewer interviews. When she went outside, she sometimes covered herself with scarves and sunglasses to avoid being recognized. While the public wanted to know more about the woman behind the music, Sade wanted the exact opposite. She wanted privacy, but she wasn't stepping away from music. Instead, she was becoming more involved in creating it. In 1988, Sade released her third studio album, Stronger Than Pride. This time, she took a much greater role in the production of the record, giving her more control over the music and the direction of the project. The album produced songs such as Love is Stronger Than Pride and Paradise, continuing the sophisticated sound that had made her famous. Yet while her professional life was becoming more controlled, her personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. Toward the end of the 1980s, Sade fell in love with Spanish filmmaker Carlos Scola Pliego. The relationship became serious, and in 1989, the two married. They eventually moved to Spain and began building a life together. But marriage brought challenges of its own. Sade's career was already enormous, and maintaining a private relationship while living under constant public attention wasn't easy. Eventually, the relationship began to fall apart. Years later, Sade would describe the end of the marriage as an extremely painful period of her life. The divorce was finalized in 1995, but the emotional impact lasted much longer. She later explained that leaving their home in Spain was particularly difficult. She recalled having to leave suddenly with only a small suitcase. For someone who had spent years appearing calm and completely in control, this was a deeply painful experience. And heartbreak wasn't the only problem she was dealing with. Back in England, Sade was facing difficulties with a house she had purchased in North London. Structural problems developed, including sagging floors, forcing her to leave the property while extensive repairs were carried out. At the same time, there were serious concerns within her family, and Sade became involved in helping her mother care for an ill relative. It was during this complicated period that she created one of the most emotionally powerful albums of her career. Love Deluxe arrived in 1992. The album sounded different from some of her earlier work. It was darker, more intimate, and filled with emotional weight. At the center of it was No Ordinary Love. The song captured the feeling of giving everything to someone and realizing that the relationship may not be equally returned. But Love Deluxe wasn't only about romantic heartbreak. Songs such as Kiss of Life, Cherish the Day, and Pearls explored different forms of love, pain, loneliness, and human suffering. Pearls, in particular, moved beyond Sade's usual romantic themes. The song focused on a woman trying to survive amid famine and conflict in Somalia. It showed another side of Sade's songwriting. She wasn't simply creating beautiful songs about relationships. She was becoming an artist capable of turning pain, injustice, loneliness, and resilience into music. And while her music was becoming deeper, her stage presence was becoming even more unforgettable. Sade had studied fashion before becoming a singer, and she used that background to shape the visual world around her performances. For one tour, she went far beyond her usual minimalist style. She worked with designer Gioia Meller-Markovich to create an extraordinary outfit known as the Suit of Light. The costume was covered with hundreds of tiny reflective stones and weighed several pounds. Under the bright stage lights, the outfit reflected light across the venue as Sade moved. It created an almost dreamlike image. But behind the glamour was an exhausting reality. She had to perform while wearing the heavy costume under intense stage lighting, all while maintaining the controlled, effortless vocal style that audiences expected from her. By this point, Sade had achieved something very few artists ever do. She had released several hugely successful albums, sold millions of records, and created songs that would remain popular for decades. But the bigger her career became, the stronger her desire to disappear became. After years of touring, personal struggles, and the constant pressure of being watched, Sade was approaching a decision that would surprise the music industry. She was ready to step away. The woman who walked away. By the early 1990s, Sade had reached a point most musicians could only dream of. She had millions of records sold, worldwide recognition, and a collection of songs that had already become classics. But behind all of that success, Sade was exhausted. Years of touring, the pressure of being famous, the collapse of her marriage, problems with her home, and difficulties within her family had taken their toll. For Sade, the answer wasn't another album. It was distance. She needed to get away from the noise. So, after the success of Love Deluxe, Sade stepped away from the spotlight and eventually left England for the Caribbean. She settled in Jamaica, hoping that a slower and more private life would give her the peace she had been missing. There, she began a relationship with music producer Bob Morgan. Then, on July 21, 1996, Sade became a mother. Having a child completely changed what mattered to her. The life of a global music star no longer seemed as important as being there for her family. She wanted ordinary things, taking care of her child, preparing meals, sleeping in her own home, and simply having a routine that didn't revolve around cameras and recording studios. But even after leaving the spotlight, Sade couldn't completely escape difficult experiences. In February 1997, she became involved in a confrontation with police in Montego Bay. According to police, Sade had failed to stop when instructed and was subsequently accused of dangerous driving, failing to obey an officer, and disorderly conduct. Sade gave a very different version of what happened. She claimed that an officer recognized her and attempted to get money from her, and that the situation escalated after she refused. Whatever the full circumstances were, the incident attracted attention because of who she was. Once again, her private life had become public. For someone who had spent years trying to escape that kind of attention, it was deeply frustrating. And then another major change came. Her relationship with Bob Morgan ended. The life she had hoped to build in Jamaica was no longer what she wanted. So Sade returned to England, this time facing life as a single mother. And once again, she chose privacy over fame. From 1992 through 2000, Sade released no new studio album. 8 years is an incredibly long time in the music business. At a time when artists were expected to constantly release new songs, make appearances, give interviews, and remain visible, Sade simply disappeared. Naturally, people began to speculate. Some wondered whether she had lost her confidence. Others believed she was afraid to perform. But Sade's reason was much simpler. She didn't want to create music just because the industry expected her to. She wanted to wait until she had something meaningful to say. And eventually, that moment arrived. In 2000, after an 8-year absence, Sade returned with Lovers Rock. The album reflected some of the influence of the Caribbean years she had experienced, but it wasn't simply a collection of romantic songs. Sade's songwriting had matured. She explored motherhood, separation, injustice, immigration, suffering, and the strength people need to survive difficult moments. By Your Side, for example, focused on the promise of standing beside someone through hardship. Immigrant explored the difficulties faced by people living far from their homeland. And Slave Song confronted the historical trauma of slavery. The woman who had once become famous for sophisticated love songs was now using her music to explore much bigger human experiences. But once again, Sade didn't remain in the spotlight for long. After touring and releasing Lovers Live, she stepped away from the public eye. This time, she moved away from the busy life of London and settled in the countryside in southwest England. Surrounded by fields, trees, and animals, she found something she had been searching for since becoming famous: an ordinary life. There were no red carpets, no constant cameras, no need to appear in the news every week, just space, family, and privacy. And eventually, another important person entered her life. In 2007, Sade met Ian Watts, a former Royal Marine and firefighter. He wasn't a celebrity and didn't seem interested in the world of fame surrounding Sade. That suited her perfectly. Sade had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted access to the famous singer. Now she had someone who could simply be part of her everyday life. She later joked that she had always imagined finding a man who knew how to chop wood and had a great smile. With her daughter, her family, and Ian by her side, Sade continued living quietly. But music had never completely disappeared. She continued writing whenever inspiration came. The challenge was that the original members of the band were no longer living in the same place or following the same routines they had when they were young musicians in London. Everyone had their own lives and responsibilities. That made creating another album much slower. Still, Sade wasn't in a hurry. And after another long period of silence, she finally returned. In 2010, 10 years after Lovers Rock, Sade released Soldier of Love. The album immediately showed that she hadn't returned simply to repeat the past. The title track had a harder, more forceful rhythm, while its lyrics reflected someone who had experienced pain but had refused to give up. Other songs on the album, including Baby Father, The Moon and the Sky, and Long Hard Road, continued exploring love, loss, family, and emotional survival. The comeback was a success. Soldier of Love earned Sade another Grammy, and the tour proved something important. Her audience had never really left. Even after years without new music, people were still waiting. But once the tour ended, Sade did what she had done before. She stepped away again. Because by then, she had learned something that fame could never change. She could live without constantly being seen, but she couldn't live without protecting the life she had built away from the spotlight. Choosing life over fame. After returning to England as a single mother, Sade made a decision that surprised the music industry. She wasn't going to rush back. From the early 1990s until 2000, she released no new studio album. In an industry where artists were expected to constantly release music and remain visible, Sade was almost completely absent. That silence created plenty of speculation. Some people wondered if she had lost her confidence. Others assumed she was afraid of performing again. But the reality was much simpler. Sade didn't want to make music just because the industry demanded it. She wanted to wait until she had something she genuinely believed was worth saying. And eventually, she did. In 2000, after 8 years away, Sade returned with Lovers Rock. The album reflected some of the musical influence she had experienced during her years in the Caribbean, but it also showed how much she had changed as a person. Her songs weren't limited to romantic relationships anymore. She explored motherhood, immigration, suffering, injustice, and the importance of standing by the people you love. By Your Side became one of the album's most recognizable songs, built around the idea of remaining beside someone when life becomes difficult. Other tracks took on much heavier subjects, showing that Sade's music had grown beyond the elegant love songs that originally made her famous. But even after returning, she didn't suddenly become obsessed with being famous again. Following the album and the Lovers Live tour, Sade once again pulled away from the public eye. She left the busy environment of London and settled into a quieter life in the countryside of southwest England. There, she could enjoy something that had become extremely valuable to her: anonymity. Instead of photographers and celebrity events, her surroundings were filled with fields, trees, and animals. It was the kind of peaceful environment where she could simply be a mother, a partner, and a private person. Then, in 2007, another important chapter began. Sade met Ian Watts, a former Royal Marine and firefighter. Unlike the people she had encountered throughout the entertainment industry, Ian wasn't a celebrity and didn't appear interested in using her fame. That was part of what made the relationship work. Sade had spent years trying to escape the attention that came with being famous. She didn't need someone who wanted to stand beside her in front of cameras. She wanted someone who could share a normal life with her. Sade once joked that she had imagined finding a man who could chop wood and had a beautiful smile. With Ian, her daughter, and the rest of her family around her, she built the quieter existence she had wanted for so long. But music was never completely gone. Sade continued writing songs, although the process was becoming slower. The original members of the band were no longer living together in London, as they had during the early days. They had their own families, projects, and responsibilities. Getting everyone together to create an album, therefore, took time, a lot of time. But Sade had never been interested in rushing. Then, in 2010, the wait finally ended. 10 years after Lovers Rock, Sade returned with Soldier of Love. And this wasn't simply an attempt to recreate the sound of her earlier successes. The title track had a tougher, more powerful rhythm, giving the album a sense of strength and determination. The lyrics also reflected someone who had been through difficult experiences, but had continued moving forward. Other songs, including Baby Father, The Moon and the Sky, and Long Hard Road, explored different sides of love, family, separation, and emotional endurance. The comeback was a major success. Soldier of Love earned Sade another Grammy, and the following tour proved that her audience had been waiting for her all along. She could disappear for years and still return to packed venues filled with people who remembered every word. But when the tour ended, Sade once again stepped away. By this point, disappearing wasn't a sign that her career was failing. It was simply how she lived. She had learned that she didn't need to be constantly visible to remain important. Her family and private life mattered more than staying in the headlines. Then, years later, Sade's family life became public for a very different reason. In 2016, her son, Isaac Theo Adu, publicly came out as a transgender man. For Sade, this became an opportunity to show the world a side of herself that she rarely revealed. Rather than rejecting her son, she stood beside him and supported his journey. Isaac later spoke openly about the relationship they shared, describing his mother as someone who had allowed him to be himself rather than forcing him to become someone else. And Sade eventually expressed those feelings through music. In 2024, she released a song called Young Lion, dedicated to Isaac as part of Transa, a project focused on trans and non-binary artists and their stories. The song was deeply personal. Instead of giving another interview about her family, Sade used music to say what she wanted to say. It became a rare glimpse into a relationship she had spent decades protecting from the public. And that may be the clearest explanation for Sade's entire career. She never disappeared because she had nothing left to offer. She disappeared because she wanted control over when, where, and why she was seen. And whenever she eventually returns, she seems determined to make sure there is a real reason for it. Is Sade coming back? For someone who has spent so much of her life protecting her privacy, Sade's decision to share a glimpse of her family through Young Lion was incredibly unusual. The song offered fans something they rarely get from Sade, a window into her personal world. But there was another surprise. After years of working separately and living their own lives, Sade and the members of her longtime band reunited at Miraval Studios in the south of France. It was a meaningful location because they had recorded parts of earlier albums there. Now, decades after their first success, they were back together, working on new music. But as expected, Sade wasn't making dramatic promises. There was no big announcement, no confirmed release date, and no album title for fans to mark on their calendars. Instead, the music was simply being created. And perhaps that's the most Sade thing she could do. She has never followed the rules of the music industry. She doesn't release music simply because people expect it. She doesn't stay in the spotlight just to remain relevant. And she doesn't explain every decision she makes. When Sade has something genuine to say, she returns. When she doesn't, she disappears. So the possibility of new music is exciting, but the bigger story is the life she has built away from fame. Sade proved that an artist doesn't have to constantly be visible to remain unforgettable. She walked away from the spotlight, protected her family, lived on her own terms, and returned only when she had something meaningful to share. And if another Sade album does eventually arrive, it probably won't feel like just another comeback. It will feel like another chapter from an artist who has spent her entire career doing things her own way. So, what do you think about Sade's decision to step away from fame? The quiet legacy of Sade beyond the music. Sade's influence has always been defined by what she chose not to do. In an industry built on constant exposure, she became a symbol of restraint. While many artists chase visibility, Sade built a career on absence, appearing only when the work truly mattered. Her impact can be felt far beyond her own discography. Countless singers across genres have cited her as an inspiration, not just for her voice, but for her artistic discipline. The way she blends soul, jazz, and pop into something timeless has shaped generations of musicians who strive for the same emotional honesty. Even her silence has become part of her identity. Each long gap between albums only increases the anticipation, turning every return into an event rather than a routine release. In a way, she redefined what longevity in music can look like, not through constant output, but through lasting relevance. And perhaps that is Sade's quiet legacy, proving that an artist doesn't need to be everywhere to be unforgettable. Sometimes, stepping back is what makes the art endure even longer. So what do you think about Sade's decision to step away from fame?